What if everything you've heard about her was a lie? They said she hosted orgies in the Pope's palace, that she wore a ring laced with poison, that she watched her lovers disappear and never flinched. They said she shared more than just blood with her brother, that behind her smile, entire kingdoms fell. But what if the truth was even more dangerous? Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of a pope, sister to a warlord, wife to kings and enemies alike, has been called many things: seductress, victim, monster, saint. For centuries, she has been blamed for crimes no one could prove, and remembered for scandals no one could forget. In this video, we're going to tear away the legend. Behind the silks and ceremonies was a woman far more powerful and far more terrifying than history wanted you to believe. Because Lucrezia didn't just survive the most corrupt court in Europe. She learned how to master it. What really happened inside the Borgia palace? What was hidden in her letters burned the day she passed? And why does her name still provoke fear, fascination, and silence? You'll want to stay until the end, because the final truth about Lucrezia Borgia was never written in any book. There are births that pass unnoticed, lost in the noise of crowded cities and the hum of ordinary lives. Then there are those that seem to bend history the moment they happen, quietly, almost invisibly at first, but with a gravity that alters everything. Lucrezia Borgia was born not with a crown, but with something far heavier: expectation. It was spring in Rome, the year 1480, in the narrow corridors of power, behind the incense-filled sanctuaries and velvet-curtained confessionals. A child's cry echoed within the walls of a cardinal's private residence. The city outside carried on with its usual pulse: merchants yelling in markets, monks walking in pairs, noblemen preparing for ceremonies they would never remember. But inside, something shifted. The girl born that day was the illegitimate daughter of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose smile could calm storms, and whose ambition burned so bright it could melt steel. Her mother, Vannozza de Catanei, was not his wife. She was, as polite society called it, a well-positioned Roman lady, known for her beauty and discretion. But to Rodrigo, she was more: a partner in image, a vessel for legacy. And their daughter, from the moment she entered the world, was not simply a child. She was a move in a long and dangerous game. Rodrigo was not just any cardinal. He was a Borgia, a name already whispered with a blend of admiration and unease. Spanish in origin, foreign in style, and aggressive in politics, the Borgias were everything the old Roman families hated and feared. Rodrigo knew this. He wore it like armor. He believed the church was not a sanctuary but a battlefield, and on that battlefield, he had plans. Lucrezia's childhood unfolded within these quiet calculations. She was raised among shadows, silk curtains, marble floors, tutors in Latin and philosophy, servants who spoke only when spoken to. From her earliest memories, the world was one of preparation, not for freedom, but for utility. She learned to walk with grace, not to enjoy movement, but to be observed. She was taught to smile, not when she felt joy, but when it served a purpose. Beauty, she quickly understood, was not a gift, it was a weapon. And in Rome, weapons were everything. By the time she was 10, Lucrezia had already been promised in marriage more than once, not for love nor even alliance, but as a signal, a gesture of proximity to power. Her father, who by then had become Pope Alexander VI, knew that nothing held Rome's attention like a beautiful daughter poised between politics and temptation. Lucrezia became that figure, carefully visible, never scandalous on the surface, but always suggesting more than she revealed. Rome changed when Rodrigo became pope. The city, already a hive of ambition, bloomed into decadence. Banquets blurred into ritual. Cardinals whispered over roasted quail and gold-gilded grapes. And the papal palace itself transformed from spiritual haven into the center of Europe's most complex web of control. The Borgia crest, golden bulls under a crimson sky, rose above Rome like a warning. Lucrezia, still a teenager, watched this all unfold from the inside. She was neither child nor adult, neither saint nor seductress. Yet the world began assigning her all these roles. Her first arranged marriage, to Giovanni Sforza of Milan, was not a love story. It was a political maneuver. The ceremony was lavish, the feast endless, the applause dutiful. But within months, the union soured. Giovanni was older, suspicious, and quickly came to realize he was not marrying into power. He was being absorbed by it. The annulment came swiftly, officially. It was claimed the marriage had never been consummated. Whispers, however, said more. That Lucrezia had not only agreed to the separation, but orchestrated it. That she was not the pawn, but the hand, moving the board. And when papal emissaries began spreading rumors that Giovanni was physically incapable of being a husband, his humiliation was complete. Yet something had changed. Rome, for all its ceremonies and rituals, was a city built on perception. And now, for the first time, the image of Lucrezia began to fracture. She was still beautiful, still elegant, but the stories surrounding her began to shift. She was no longer simply the Pope's daughter. She was now the woman who had ruined a nobleman, who smiled through court accusations, who seemed too calm for someone so young. Soon after another marriage, Alfonso of Aragon, a handsome young noble from Naples, became her next husband. This time, things were different. There was real affection, at least at first. Letters between them spoke of longing, of small gestures, of nights where politics disappeared, if only for hours. But Lucrezia was never allowed to live for herself. Alfonso, though charming, represented a threat to the shifting alliances of the Borgia world. When he became inconvenient, the machinery moved again. One night, Alfonso was attacked by unknown assailants. He survived the first attempt. Lucrezia stayed at his side, nursing him, guarding him, but protection was impossible. The second attack came silently, within the palace walls. Alfonso did not leave the chamber again. Officially, his passing was tragic. Unofficially, it was necessary. Lucrezia did not cry in public. She did not protest. She vanished for a time into private apartments, emerging later as serene as ever. The people whispered. They said she was cold, that she had known, that she had chosen loyalty to her brother Cesare over affection for her husband. And though none could prove her role, the stain remained. From then on, Lucrezia was no longer described as merely clever. She was dangerous. Cesare, her brother, was everything the Renaissance admired and feared. Brilliant, cruel, magnetic. His bond with Lucrezia became the center of endless rumors. Too close, too intense. Portraits showed them standing not as siblings, but as conspirators. Their eyes met not with warmth, but with calculation. When Cesare acted, Lucrezia followed. When he vanished from the city, she withdrew. When he returned, she bloomed. Together, they redefined fear in Rome. There were banquets held beneath candlelit ceilings where guests were hand-selected not for loyalty, but for usefulness. There were feasts where politics were served alongside roasted boar, and where every glance could be a signal or a sentence. At one infamous event, known only in later records as the Banquet of Chestnuts, the stories defy belief. Dancers performed without shame. Favors were exchanged in ways the church never taught, and Lucrezia draped. Yet these stories, repeated and embellished across Europe, often told more about the world that invented them than about Lucrezia herself. They painted her as the embodiment of vice, of ambition, of female power unrestrained. But behind the scandal lay something quieter, a young woman constantly moved, shaped and sacrificed for the ambitions of others, a survivor navigating a city that devoured innocence. And then, change. A final marriage, this time to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. It was not an obvious match. His family despised the Borgias, and Lucrezia carried the weight of every rumor ever whispered about her. But she entered Ferrara not as a fallen daughter of Rome, but as a noble woman determined to build something lasting. Over time, she transformed, not into someone different, but into someone fully realized. In Ferrara, she patronized the arts. She reformed court rituals. She oversaw civic projects. Those who met her now described not scandal, but brilliance, not danger, but dignity. And yet, the past clung to her like perfume, faint but never gone. Letters were burned, diaries vanished, documents destroyed, as if she, too, understood that the story written about her would always eclipse the truth. When her time came, it was quiet. No grand drama, no poisoned rings, just silence. Her body was buried, her name remained. And what rose in its place was something rare, an icon, both reviled and revered. A myth, a warning, a fascination. Lucrezia Borgia did not choose the world she was born into, but she mastered it. And in doing so, she became something greater than legend. She became unforgettable. The road from Rome to Ferrara was long, but not just in distance. It was a descent from fire to frost. Rome was noise, indulgent, corrupt, vivid in its hunger for power and pleasure. Ferrara, by contrast, was a fortress of restraint, ruled not by appetite but by formality, pride and tradition. If Rome had made Lucrezia dangerous, Ferrara would make her prove it. When she arrived in 1502 as the new bride of Alfonso d'Este, heir to the House of Este, she carried more than trunks of jewelry and silks. She brought with her the weight of rumor, of scandal too widespread to contain, too profitable to correct. She was, to the Ferraran court, a woman drenched in whispered sins, alleged poisoner, seductress, and above all, Borgia. The duchy had not wanted her. The Este family had resisted the match, disliking both her blood and her baggage. But political winds had shifted yet again. Rome's influence remained significant. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, had offered sweetened dowry terms that could not be ignored. Ferrara, pragmatic as ever, relented. And so Lucrezia entered the gates as both prize and liability. The nobles watched her closely, the women silently, the men curiously. Some hoped she would live up to the image they had crafted of her, the femme fatale, the Vatican's golden serpent. Others expected collapse, a scandal, a misstep. One mistake, and they could dismiss her as the woman Rome had raised her to be. But she gave them nothing. Lucrezia did not storm Ferrara. She softened into it. Her entrance was graceful, calculated. She did not wield her presence like a weapon, but offered it like a mirror, reflecting back the expectations placed upon her, then quietly rewiring them. In court gatherings, she listened more than she spoke. In private, she studied the city, its rhythms, its rivalries, its weaknesses. And then, slowly, she began to work. not through confrontation but cultivation. She elevated the cultural life of Ferrara, not merely funding musicians and painters, but creating a court that rivaled Florence in refinement. She understood that beauty could be political, that literature and pageantry could stabilize power more effectively than force. Poets like Ludovico Ariosto, scholars, theologians, they all found in her a patroness not only with gold, but with vision. The city responded. What began as tolerance shifted into admiration. Still, she had enemies. Some mocked her carefully composed serenity as artificial. Others accused her of secret correspondence with Rome, with Cesare, whose star was already in decline. There were murmurs that poison followed her, as it always had, invisible and patient. But none of this was ever proven. And Lucrezia did not answer slander with denial. She simply outlasted it. The transformations were not only political or artistic, they were personal. Her marriage to Alfonso d'Este was never tender in the way of poetry, but it matured into an alliance of mutual respect. He was a soldier, practical, pragmatic, and protective of his city's reputation. At first, he kept his distance. What she could not change, she endured. Pregnancy became a recurring rhythm in her life, and with it, physical suffering, anxiety, and, in many cases, loss. She carried many children, but only a few survived. Each time, she would vanish from public life, quietly recovering in her chambers, only to return weeks or months later, composed and luminous, as if untouched. But those who served closest to her noted the fatigue behind her eyes, the moments of stillness that lasted too long. The letters burned late at night. Still, she continued. In Rome, the Borgia name collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. Her father's passing triggered immediate chaos. Cesare, without papal protection, was hunted, captured, escaped, and eventually met his end not on a throne but in a muddy ambush in Navarre. The world that had shaped Lucrezia fell like a stage set pulled down mid-performance, but she did not fall with it. By the time Rome forgot the Borgias, Ferrara had embraced Lucrezia. She was no longer the Pope's daughter, no longer the pawn of Vatican scandal. She was the Duchess, thoughtful, composed, enigmatic, and in that transformation, she achieved something none of her family had: longevity. She had not conquered cities, nor ruled with an iron fist. She had survived. In time, her public role deepened. She involved herself directly in diplomacy, especially during times of war and tension with neighboring states. Her letters, dozens of which remain, reveal a woman of precision, clarity, and careful charm. She was not theatrical. She was strategic. Her words never wasted. Her tone always tempered. She knew how to ask for things without appearing to ask, how to make men believe they had decided what she had already chosen. The scandals by then were distant echoes, but the myth clung to her shadow. Even as she knelt at Mass, even as she funded hospitals and convents, there were those who swore they saw in her eyes the same glint that once gleamed through the Borgia halls, a sharpness hidden beneath silk, a mind that could calculate loyalty and betrayal in the same breath. Whether this was true, or whether it was simply the world refusing to let go of its favorite villainess, no one could say for certain. But Lucrezia did not argue with her legend. She wore it, and in her final years, that legend began to settle into something stranger than fiction. Not the tale of a wicked daughter, but of a woman too complex to be understood by a single generation. A woman who had lived through every role assigned to her: temptress, puppet, poisoner, ruler, and outlasted them all. The records of her last days are blurred with uncertainty. One final pregnancy drained her health. Fevers came and went. Physicians tried and failed. She grew weak, and the court grew quiet. There was no scandal, no intrigue, no drama, only a long stillness. When the end arrived, it was not theatrical, it was private. Ferrara mourned her, not as a warning, not as a scandal, but as a sovereign. Her image remained in frescoes, her name in city ledgers, her correspondence in iron-bound archives. She had entered history not through battle, but through resilience, and while others had written their legacies in blood and flame, Lucrezia Borgia had written hers in whispers, enduring, evasive, unforgettable. History is rarely content with facts. It prefers symbols. It gathers what it can from the ash and parchment, then smooths the edges, sharpens the shadows, and builds a legend more satisfying than truth. And few figures have been shaped and reshaped with such persistence as Lucrezia Borgia. After her passing, the process began almost immediately. Her real life, documented in court records, diplomatic letters, and financial ledgers, slowly gave way to something more intoxicating: myth. Writers, artists, and gossip-mongers pieced together an image that would outlive the woman herself. An image not built from evidence, but from suspicion, contradiction, and cultural desire. They painted her as a temptress of rare cunning, a master of deception, a beauty who masked a pitiless mind. She was cast as a lover of her brother, the daughter who served her father's darkest ambitions, the hostess of orgies, the keeper of poison rings. Each tale more lurid than the last, each exaggeration echoing louder than the records that could contradict it. And yet, beneath that scandalous silhouette, traces of the real Lucrezia still gleamed. The woman who survived the Vatican's political inferno, the noble who restored dignity to Ferrara, the patron of arts who transformed her court into a sanctuary for musicians and poets, the strategist who balanced diplomacy and danger with near-surgical grace. These truths remained, not loud, not celebrated, but persistent, and they began to push back. In the centuries that followed, interpretations shifted like tides. During the Enlightenment, Lucrezia became a symbol of moral decay, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and feminine manipulation. In the Romantic era, she was reinvented again, this time as a tragic heroine, misunderstood, forced into roles she did not choose. By the 19th century, she was the star of novels, operas, and plays, not always accurate, but always captivating. Victor Hugo imagined her as a haunted, complex figure, beautiful, intelligent, and doomed. Donizetti's opera turned her into a melodramatic icon, full of passion and grief. Painters cast her in velvets and golds, lounging among shadows, eyes framed in mystery. In each retelling, her story morphed into whatever fit the fears or fantasies of the age. And through it all, one thing remained constant: fascination. Why? Because Lucrezia Borgia occupied a space that few historical women were allowed to inhabit. She was neither saint nor caricature. She was power wrapped in elegance, influence cloaked in charm, neither fully innocent nor entirely guilty. In a world that demanded women be either idealized or condemned, she refused to be fully either. Even now, historians continue to debate the core of her identity. Was she a victim of her family's schemes, or an active player in them? Did she orchestrate courtly manipulations with her own hand? Or was she merely reacting, adapting to survive the choices of men more dangerous than herself? Was she complicit in darker deeds, or simply nearby when they occurred? The evidence is thin in places, contradictory in others. For every claim of poison, there is a lack of proof. For every rumor of forbidden intimacy, a lack of reliable witness. But perhaps the greater truth lies not in confirmation, but in the questions themselves. In the fact that Lucrezia Borgia became a lens through which generations projected their anxieties about power, women, and control. And perhaps that is her most enduring legacy. She has become a mirror, not of sin, but of complexity. In an age where women were denied agency, she exercised it. In a system designed to consume and discard, she adapted and endured. Her story may have begun as a daughter used for political gain, but it ended as a woman who shaped a city, a culture, and an enduring myth. Even today, her name carries weight. Mention Lucrezia Borgia, and the reaction is never neutral. There is a spark of recognition, curiosity, sometimes scandalized intrigue. She remains unforgettable, not because she was the most corrupt or the most virtuous, but because she was one of the few who managed to be both survivor and legend, real and unreal in equal measure. Walk the halls of Ferrara, and echoes remain. A portrait behind glass, a faded letter, a signature at the base of a law once passed. Read the old books, and you'll find her again, veiled in metaphor, twisted by time, illuminated by candlelight, in stories still half true. And in the quietest corners of the Vatican archives, beneath layers of dust and sealed wax, are fragments of her world. Not enough to tell the full truth, but just enough to remind us that behind every myth is a person who once breathed. Lucrezia Borgia lived not to defy history, but to survive it. And in doing so, she became part of something rarer than myth. She became enduring ambiguity, the kind history never quite knows how to finish. There are those who leave behind kingdoms, others, ideas. And then there are a rare few whose very existence becomes a riddle too powerful for history to solve. Lucrezia Borgia was no longer simply a duchess, a woman of court, or even a memory in the minds of those who had known her. With her final breath, she passed beyond biography. What remained was something stranger, not quite a symbol, not quite a ghost. Centuries passed, and still, she refused to disappear. The name persisted like a stain and shimmered like gold. In every era that followed her own, Lucrezia reappeared, not always in body, but in stories. Like a mirror pulled from the past, she showed each generation something they did not wish to see. The volatility of beauty, the proximity of innocence to cruelty, and the fear that control over one's life might come at a cost that cannot be measured. Long after Ferrara had moved on, and Rome had buried its Borgia secrets under layers of marble and ceremony, her name continued to disturb and delight. Not because she had written a manifesto, not because she had conquered empires, but because she had become the ultimate question mark, a figure whose very ambiguity invited obsession. Writers returned to her as if to a crime scene no one could quite decipher. In private libraries, she appeared in the margins of letters and in the footnotes of monastic journals, mentioned not with clarity, but with caution. In paintings, she was draped in velvets so rich they seemed to burn, her face pale, unreadable, lips just on the edge of speech. No matter the canvas, the angle remained the same. A woman who could not be named without uncertainty. She became what the world feared most, a woman with history, but no one narrative. For some, she was the victim, a child caught in the gears of ecclesiastical ambition, used, discarded, reclaimed, a creature of context, molded not by desire but by necessity. To others, she was the manipulator, composed and aware, draped in silk and sharpened intent, a hand always near the cup. Neither portrayal could be confirmed, and both were, in their own way, true. Even the Church, which had long sought to bury her beneath other scandals, could not fully erase her. The archives could be redacted, letters could be removed. But every time someone told the story of Alexander VI or Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia returned, sometimes as a footnote, sometimes as a shadow, sometimes as a storm. Art did what records could not. She found her way into the gaze of 19th century romantics, who painted her not as a sinner, but as a sorrowful enchantress, more Medea than Medusa. They imagined her torn between duty and longing, wielding poison only because steel was denied her. Opera houses echoed with her name, her story twisted into songs that made audiences weep for the woman they had been taught to fear. In this transformation, something important occurred. She was not forgiven. She was reclaimed. But even reclamation could not settle the contradictions. Modern historians, armed with fragments and fragments of fragments, tried to reassemble the pieces. Some reduced her to circumstance, a victim of misinterpretation and malicious propaganda. Others warned against such revisionism, reminding that power, no matter how elegantly worn, is never entirely clean. The truth, as it always was with Lucrezia, lives somewhere in the breath between. We know she administered courts with skill. We know she wrote with elegance and insight. We know she maintained correspondence with poets, advised dukes, and managed her own household staff with a level of independence few noble women ever achieved. And we also know she was never far from the engines of consequence. Marriages arranged for leverage, removals too clean to be accidents, names that vanished quietly from court records after crossing her family. Did she order it? Or did she simply stop it? Did she act? Or did she allow? The lines are too faint, the evidence too scattered, the voices too contradictory. Yet this is what keeps her alive. Not a single act, but the eternal fog surrounding the question of agency. Lucrezia Borgia became not a villain, not a saint, but a fulcrum on which the definition of power continues to sway. And power, after all, was her constant companion. Not the power of crowns or armies, she had none of those, but the subtler kind. Influence without speech, change without confrontation, survival in a world that claimed to adore women, but in truth feared what they could become if they were allowed to move freely, to think deeply, to choose. Lucrezia chose, again and again. When her first husband proved too weak, she let him fall. When her second was torn away by ambition, she did not retaliate. When her brother ruled with fire, she ruled with silence. When her father passed and her house collapsed, she did not follow him into ruin. She remade herself, not once, but multiple times. And that act, more than any legend of poison or pleasure, is why her name still lingers. In the modern world, her face has returned in fiction and film, in museums and media, drawn again and again because we still do not know what to do with her. Is she the original femme fatale, or is she proof that even amid corruption, a woman can rise without losing everything to it? To some, she is a cautionary tale. To others, a feminist icon in disguise. To all, she is a reminder that history is not made only by those who win battles, sign treaties, or wear crowns. Sometimes it is made by those who survive what others cannot, who step through the ruins of myth and do not ask to be understood, only remembered. And Lucrezia Borgia, above all, is remembered, not for one moment, but for never becoming just one thing. Time has a strange relationship with scandal. It devours detail and preserves silhouette. Names like Lucrezia Borgia stop being attached to dates or places. Instead, they become flavors, invoked to suggest danger, seduction, betrayal. Over centuries, her reality was slowly eclipsed, not erased, but rewritten. What remained was not Lucrezia, but an idea shaped by everyone but her. In the hands of propagandists, her image served as a warning. A woman with too much access to power, too much charm, too much mind for the world around her to be comfortable. Enemies of the papacy used her name to stain Catholic authority. Enemies of women in politics used her as the ultimate example of what happens when beauty and intelligence converge without male control. In every case, her identity was stretched, bent, recolored to fit someone else's narrative. She was used as a weapon against her own descendants.
The House of Este, which had grown to tolerate her, then respect her, eventually found themselves distancing from the very legacy she helped build. As new generations took control of Ferrara, they emphasized other names, other faces. Lucrezia's letters were quietly boxed away. Her portrait moved to less visible walls. Her story softened or sterilized depending on the politics of the moment. In eras of conservative morality, she became a monster. In eras of romantic rebellion, a misunderstood heroine. In revolutions, she was held up as a symbol of the corruption of elites. In feminist retellings, she was reclaimed as a woman who survived the male theater of cruelty with brilliance and grace. And in Gothic fiction, she became something darker, a specter of danger wrapped in velvet and shadow. The truth? It remained elusive. Lucrezia Borgia had become everyone's puppet, long after she had stopped being anyone's pawn. Even her physical image evolved to match the fantasy. Painters from centuries after her passing imagined her with flowing golden hair, eyes glinting like amber, a mouth that hinted at secrets. Some showed her holding vials, others surrounded her with serpents. One particularly famous canvas depicted her as both Madonna and murderess, half halo, half shadow. No historical source confirms her likeness, and yet millions believe they have seen her. Such is the power of suggestion. The name Borgia today still summons images of gold-drenched power, of sin dressed in elegance, of danger masquerading as divine favor. And always, always, at the heart of that image is Lucrezia, not her father, the Pope, not her brother, the warlord, but her. Because she represented something more enduring than papal corruption or political murder. She represented complexity, and complexity, when worn by a woman, has always frightened the world more than cruelty worn by men. Her myth persisted because it was useful. Every time a writer needed to conjure a female figure both alluring and deadly, Lucrezia's shadow reappeared. Every time an empire needed to blame moral decline on temptation rather than ambition, her name was dusted off like a weapon pulled from the shelf. Even in popular culture today, she appears in novels, films, series, sometimes as a tragic beauty, sometimes as a quiet figure, rarely as a human being. Because to humanize her would be to dismantle the architecture of centuries, to say, she did not poison dozens, she did not dance in orgiastic feasts, she did not seduce are names that rest in books, and then there are names that refuse to stay on the page. They hover, they linger, they bleed through the margins like ink spilled too fast. Lucrezia Borgia's name is like that, whispered more often than spoken, imagined more vividly than remembered. She exists now not as memory, but as atmosphere. To speak of her is to awaken something, not just about her, but about ourselves. It began slowly. At first, her story remained buried in Latin texts, court records, the private correspondences of men who survived her. These documents were dry, clinical, often distant. But even there, the contradictions began to breathe. One ambassador called her refined and gracious, another dangerous and unreadable. One praised her charity, another accused her of seduction. No consensus, just fragments. Like trying to reconstruct a portrait from scattered reflections in broken glass. By the 17th century, her legend had begun its metamorphosis. Writers no longer needed facts, they needed shadows. And Lucrezia provided the perfect silhouette. In France, she was molded into a literary archetype, a woman of irresistible beauty whose virtue was constantly in question. In Spain, she was used as a warning, a symbol of Rome's decadence. In Protestant circles, she became a useful villain, proof of Catholic corruption. In Italy, depending on the political wind, she was either a stain or a star. But it was the 19th century that truly claimed her. The romantic imagination, obsessed with contradiction, ruined with the beautiful tragic, found in Lucrezia a muse it could not resist. They painted her not as wicked, but as misunderstood, a delicate creature forced to survive in a cage of ambition and deceit, a rose growing from blood-stained marble. This Lucrezia was fragile, poetic, burdened with secrets too terrible to speak aloud. Victor Hugo captured her in his darkest theatrical works. Donizetti gave her a voice that soared through operatic tragedy. Poets wept over her fate in lines of trembling verse. Each version pushed her further from reality and closer to something sacred, not in the literal sense, but in the symbolic. She had become an emblem of what it meant to be female in a world that punished power and punished weakness equally. Her supposed crimes were magnified until they became myth. Her silence in the records became a canvas for male anxiety. And her survival, the fact that she navigated through a family like the Borgias and emerged not destroyed but transformed, became an enigma historians could never fully resolve. In the 20th century, the image changed again. Lucrezia re-entered popular imagination through film, literature, and eventually television. She was no longer just a historical figure. She was a brand, a name used to sell intrigue. Novels romanticized her as a femme fatale. Movies turned her into a gothic beauty. Television shows, eager for spectacle, gave her dagger-sharp dialogue and unblinking eyes that could melt men or order their ruin. She was played as naive, then as calculating, then as both. She was a mother, a lover, a liar, a queen of sin, a victim of systems, a master of them, always beautiful, always deadly, always misunderstood, and the public consumed it. Because beneath all the exaggerations, something real still pulsed. A woman, surrounded by power, shaped by danger, forced to navigate a world where her survival depended on what she would appear to be, not what she was. And that story has never stopped being relevant. In the 21st century, her image has become even more elusive. Modern feminism has embraced her complexity. Scholars now argue that she was not a seductress, but a survivor of systemic control. That her reputation was not earned, but signed. That the darkness surrounding her was less about her actions and more about male fear of a woman who lived too freely, thought too clearly, smiled too calmly under pressure. Yet others push back. They caution against sanitizing her too fully, against turning her into a pure victim. Because Lucrezia was not passive. She adapted, she participated, she had agency, even if it was limited, and she used it. She was neither puppet nor puppeteer, but something far more dangerous to historical comfort. A morally ambiguous woman in an age that allowed women no ambiguity. She belonged to a family that reshaped Europe. She ruled a court that outlived kings. She buried secrets deeper than her biographers could ever reach. And she left behind not answers, but echoes. In every century, someone tries to settle her, to label her, to bury her under one sentence, one identity, one headline. And every time, she slips away. Because the truth is, Lucrezia Borgia cannot be contained. She was born into a world that wanted her beautiful, silent, and obedient. She emerged clever, quiet, and impossible to define. That was her sin. That was her strength. That is why we still remember her. Not as a lesson, not as a warning, but as a question. And the question is this: what happens when a woman learns to survive in a world designed to erase her?
History thought it had buried her in scandal, but all it did was give her room to become immortal. There comes a point when history stops asking what someone did and begins asking what they meant. That is where Lucrezia Borgia now lives. Not in the facts of her lifetime, but in the meaning her name has gathered in the centuries since. She is no longer just a daughter of the Vatican, or a Duchess of Ferrara, or even a rumored poisoner. She has become something else. A symbol, a myth, a story that rewrites itself with every new voice that speaks it. She does not rest in the past. She floats in the present, waiting for reinterpretation. And no matter how many biographies are written, how many documents are unearthed, the truth is this: Lucrezia Borgia has become a living idea, one that mutates, survives, and resurfaces wherever power, desire, and danger intersect. In some eras, she stands in the shadows of court dramas, the ultimate plot device, the beautiful woman whose smile hides a secret. In others, she reappears as a visual icon, painted in gold and blood, her hands graceful, her gaze unfathomable. In literature, she is reborn as a symbol of corruption wrapped in velvet. In film, she drifts between archetypes: the seductress, the survivor, the witch in silk gloves. And in every retelling, she gains something and loses something. Because the farther she gets from the truth, the more powerful she becomes. She has been used to explore the danger of women in politics. She has been used to warn of desire's consequences. She has been used to suggest that beauty can be fatal, that family loyalty can be twisted, that the church itself once gave birth to monsters. But more than anything, she has been used to ask one question over and over: what happens when a woman refuses to die on history's terms? She refused, not only in life, but in the memory that followed. The Vatican tried to erase her. Artists tried to define her. Writers tried to claim her. And yet, she continues to haunt them all, elusive, reappearing in new forms, never exactly as they imagined. This is no accident. Lucrezia Borgia has become a prism, and what you see in her says more about you than about her. A man who fears her sees manipulation. A woman who understands her sees adaptation. A historian sees contradiction. A romantic sees tragedy. A cynic sees propaganda. And a realist sees something terrifyingly simple. A woman who understood the game of power and played it better than anyone expected her to. In a world that demanded female obedience, she offered composure. In a church that preached purity, she wore mystery. In a court where beauty was supposed to mean silence, she became strategic. She spoke softly, but her influence thundered. And when she was accused, again and again, she did not defend. She simply endured. And this, more than any act of crime or virtue, is what made her eternal. Because history is drawn to noise, but haunted by silence. and Lucrezia Borgia was silent in the right places. She said little when rumors swirled. She left letters behind, but never the full story. She let others speak for her and outlived them all. That is not weakness, that is design. And now, centuries later, when her name is spoken, on screen, in books, in whispered fascination, she is no longer just a character. She is an invitation to look closer, to question the narrative, to realize that the most dangerous woman in history may never have committed any crime at all, except refusing to vanish when she was told. And that crime, in the eyes of the powerful, is unforgivable. But to the rest of us, it is unforgettable. She walks beside us now, even if we do not notice. Not in the sense of a ghost, bound to a crumbling villa or a forgotten tomb, but as a presence, stitched into the way we speak about ambition, morality, and the limits of how we define womanhood. Lucrezia Borgia is no longer confined to Rome, to Ferrara, or even to the pages of history books. She lives in the language we use when we describe a woman who is too poised, too mysterious, too competent, too untouched by judgment. She has become an adjective, a warning, a fascination. Her name is invoked not to explain the past, but to describe the present. That is the rarest form of legacy. Even in the modern world, when we claim to value nuance and reject caricature, the story of Lucrezia Borgia remains trapped between extremes. She is either the poisoner in velvet or the misunderstood angel. Rarely both. Rarely more. Rarely real. Because the truth of her life is harder to sit with than the fiction. It is not comfortable to believe that a woman might be capable, intelligent, loyal, calculating, moral, and morally flexible, all at once. It's easier to split her into two clean archetypes and pick a side. But Lucrezia resisted sides. She resisted simplification. She refused to be one thing. And that refusal is what keeps her relevant. In a world still governed by narrative warfare, where public figures are devoured by media cycles, where perception becomes more powerful than action, and where the space allowed to women in power is still carved from suspicion, Lucrezia Borgia stands as a strange kind of pioneer. Not a saint, not a villain, but a woman who learned to survive by becoming whatever the moment required, and by never letting the world truly know which part of her was masked and which was face. Even now, she provokes unease. In classrooms, her name is often skipped or reduced to a single line of scandal. In popular retellings, she is a device, the woman behind the poison, the sister in the shadow of a tyrant, the daughter of corruption, but never the strategist, never the reformer of Ferrara's court rituals, never the patron of the arts whose taste shaped cultural movements, never the silent observer who outlived every man who tried to own her story. And yet, the records exist. Letters in her own hand, fluid, controlled, emotionally restrained, yet intellectually sharp. Inventories signed by her. Diplomatic messages written not as dictated orders, but as crafted negotiations. Testimonies of her kindness, too, preserved in the words of those who served her directly. Chambermaids, midwives, servants who wrote not for posterity, but out of private loyalty. These fragments show something few expect. A life filled not just with intrigue, but with administration, with empathy, with the exhausting daily labor of holding power without ever appearing to grip it too tightly. This is not the story people want. Because it does not burn, it does not scandalize, it does not give us a clean answer to the question, was she evil or merely surrounded by it? But this, in truth, is her final defiance. Lucrezia Borgia does not end. She cannot be resolved. She cannot be cancelled, cleared, canonized, or condemned. She is not a figure to be finalized. She is a question, a slow, haunting one that asks us, why are we still so obsessed with women who survive power instead of those who merely wield it? Why does beauty in a woman threaten credibility? Why do we believe that silence equals guilt when it may be the only weapon left to those not allowed to speak? In her silence, Lucrezia said everything. She let others write their fictions. She let her name be twisted and refracted through centuries of projection. She gave up control of her image, and in doing so, ensured that no one could ever truly own it. That, perhaps, was her ultimate victory. And so, as we close the long corridor of her story, we are left not with a final scene, not a deathbed, not a courtroom, not a last whispered confession. We are left instead with a locked door, and behind it, a woman still watching, still adapting, still waiting to be seen for who she really was. Or perhaps exactly as she wanted to be remembered. She crossed the threshold from mortal to myth long before the world was ready for it. Once bound to papal palaces and Italian city-states, Lucrezia Borgia began her second life in the imaginations of writers, dramatists, and painters. Not as a historical subject, but as a muse of duality. Her image now served as a canvas onto which each generation projected its own moral anxieties, fantasies, and fears. In the Enlightenment, when logic and virtue were set against superstition and corruption, Lucrezia became a tool of condemnation. Writers looking to expose the moral rot of papal Rome seized upon her legend. She was presented as evidence that even the Church's most sacred offices could produce scandal, seduction, and secrecy. Her name became shorthand for hypocrisy, cloaked in lace, for power unconfessed, for vice passed down like inheritance. But it was the Romantic Age that truly claimed her. She appeared not just in prose, but in poetry, tragic, luminous, damned. Her beauty was painted not as seductive, but as sorrowful. Her sin, not active, but fated. In this version, Lucrezia was a flower grown in poisoned soil, the victim of a monstrous lineage, a soul wrapped in gold, but drenched in grief. Authors recast her as a woman torn between duty and desire, dignity and destruction, a contradiction rendered in velvet and candlelight. These were not acts of restoration. They were acts of rebirth, and they prepared the ground for what would come next. As the modern world emerged, with its cameras, its screens, its hunger for characters more than truths, Lucrezia reappeared once again. This time not as a historical figure, but as an icon of entertainment. She was no longer confined to libraries and salons. Now she walked through film sets, stage plays, novels, costume dramas, and psychological thrillers. She shifted forms with ease. In some retellings, she was a cold-blooded manipulator, emotionless, strategic, lethal behind a smile. In others, she was sensual and tragic, trapped between men, aching for a freedom she would never be allowed to name. More recently, she has been rewritten again, now as a woman of fierce internal conflict, aware of her role in the power games of men, but desperate to define her own rules. Each new version said less about her, and more about us. Because the way we see Lucrezia is the way we see the limits of womanhood. In patriarchal literature, she is the warning. In feminist discourse, she is the case study. In psychological profiles, she is the paradox. Is she the product of systemic control or an architect of her own escape? Is she guilty or simply feared? And in those questions lies the most profound part of her story: its refusal to end. Even now, Lucrezia Borgia does not rest. She continues to haunt the fringes of politics, culture, and gender debate. Her name is invoked when discussing powerful women who are framed more by rumor than by reality. When public figures are dissected not for their actions, but for their composure. When accusations stick not because they're proven, but because they feel true. Because the woman in question doesn't look guilty enough to be innocent. Lucrezia's story mirrors this pattern with uncanny precision. She was accused not because there was evidence, but because there was space for imagination. She became the villain of choice in a time that had no language for ambitious women who did not conform, who did not confess, who did not collapse under scrutiny. That legacy, still active today, is her shadow across the centuries. Because when a woman dares to move through power with elegance, without breaking, without apologizing, the world often chooses myth over truth. It chooses to believe she must be hiding something, that her smile conceals poison, that her silence proves guilt, and that suspicion never dies. It simply changes costume. You see it in the way powerful women are interviewed, with tones of disbelief rather than inquiry. You see it in how the word ambition is praised in men and questioned in women. You see it in the ways fictional female characters are still written. Always brilliant, but broken. Strong, but cold. Free, but punished. These are the echoes of Lucrezia Borgia, not as person, but as precedent. She set the pattern. Or rather, the world set it on her. And now, centuries later, we still walk within it. Even the use of her name in modern media speaks volumes. Marketing teams know it provokes interest. Borgia suggests scandal. It sells stories before they're told. It paints the character in one stroke. No explanation needed. Because audiences already know what to expect, or think they do. That's the brilliance of the myth. It does not require confirmation. It only requires repetition. And Lucrezia's myth has been repeated so often that it now exists independently of her. It has become a code, a metaphor, a ghost that haunts the idea of female power, no matter the century. But here's the final twist. The woman herself, beneath all the legends, may have lived a life quieter than any of the tales suggest. A woman who adapted because she had to, who suffered losses and wore them without display, who managed estates, wrote careful letters, buried children, advised dukes, survived betrayals. A woman who endured not because she was ruthless, but because she was resilient. That version of Lucrezia is harder to sell. It does not fit neatly into scandal or sainthood, but it may be the truest of all. There are women who vanish with time. History forgets them, buries them in footnotes, names them once and lets them dissolve. Then there are those whose stories do not just remain. They grow, expand, twist, resurface. Lucrezia Borgia is one of those, but she is something more. She is not remembered in spite of history. She is remembered because she transcended it. In her, we see the story of a woman shaped by forces larger than herself: family, politics, power, perception, and yet, somehow, she never surrendered to any of them completely. She played the part of daughter, wife, mother, duchess, but none of these titles fully held her. She slipped between them, not out of rebellion, but out of something more radical: survival through transformation. The world around her demanded submission. She gave silence. The world demanded confession. She gave performance. The world demanded guilt. She gave grace. And in that refusal to break, to become only what she was told to be, she earned the kind of immortality that is not granted, but taken. Now, as the centuries have passed, we must ask, why does she still live in our minds? What makes her name feel so alive in a world that has moved so far beyond Renaissance palaces, poisoned rings, and courtly scandal? The answer lies in something deeper than biography. Lucrezia Borgia has survived because she reveals something uncomfortable, something we are still trying to understand, that a woman navigating power must do so in shadows, because the light is often too dangerous. That silence can be louder than accusation. That ambiguity, when worn well, becomes its own kind of invincibility. Lucrezia's myth has been used by every generation to explain its own fears. In the 16th century, she represented the corrupting reach of the church. In the 18th, the moral decay of aristocracy. In the 19th, she was cast as the tragic Gothic heroine. And in the 20th, the perfect villainess. Now, in the 21st, she is being reclaimed. Not as a romantic icon or a monster, but as something much more complex. A woman who endured everything the world threw at her and refused to disappear. She has become a symbol not of sin, but of narrative power. Because Lucrezia Borgia has no fixed shape, she is the version told by her enemies. She is the version guessed at by artists. She is the woman behind the eyes of every story society has tried to control. Every woman accused before she was understood, feared before she was known, punished simply for existing in the wrong century, in the wrong palace, with the wrong last name. She is the archetype of the woman who cannot win, because to survive in a man's world is already a kind of rebellion, and to do so beautifully is unforgivable. And so her story remains suspended, neither closed nor open, neither condemned nor redeemed. It lives in opera houses where her name is sung with tragedy and fire. It echoes in novels that make her the architect of desire and dread. It flickers on television screens, her face reborn again and again. Not hers, truly, but someone's idea of her. Always someone's idea. And yet, the real woman, the one who walked quietly through the halls of Ferrara, who smiled politely as emissaries studied her for cracks, who wrote careful letters to calm crises and soothed court rivalries with gentle resolve. That woman remains hard to reach, not because she left no trace, but because the world buried it beneath more dramatic inventions. She was not the loudest Borgia. She was the most enduring. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, ruled with force and was vilified. Her brother, Cesare, carved his name into history with steel and cruelty, and eventually fell to it. But Lucrezia? She outlived them both. Not in body, and that is what the world cannot let go of. There is, at the heart of Lucrezia's legend, a stillness, a center that does not ask to be liked or hated. It asks only to be seen. But for centuries, we refused to look directly. We painted her into extremes because the truth, the complicated, careful, morally ambiguous woman, was too difficult to digest, too real, too much like ourselves. But the moment we stopped trying to resolve her, to clear her name or destroy it, we begin to understand what she really was. A woman who lived in a time that denied her agency, and yet moved through it with quiet mastery. A woman who watched powerful men fall and learned how not to follow them. A woman who accepted that survival was not glory, but that it was, in the end, enough. She never gave the world what it wanted, and that is why it never stopped asking. Even now, in a world lit by screens and fed by spectacle, we return to her. Because she reminds us that some stories, the best stories, are not loud. They are patient. They are subtle. They slip past judgment. endure the noise, and leave behind not answers, but questions that echo forever. Lucrezia Borgia is one of those stories. She will not end. Because as long as we fear the woman who smiles without confession, as long as we punish beauty laced with silence, as long as we remain uncomfortable with the idea that power, grace, and danger can live in the same body, we will always, always return to her, not for closure, but for reflection. And in the final analysis, perhaps that was all she ever wanted. Not to be loved, not to be feared, but to be understood.